Welcome back. Now it's time to actually make an API call. So instead of just making a toast here in our get location weather details, we actually want to connect to the API and get the data. Okay, so what we're going to use is Retrofit. So val retrofit, and we prepared Retrofit, right? So Retrofit, and it will be of type Retrofit. Okay, so this will be a Retrofit object. Now we need to import Retrofit for this to work. Let's do that. And I need to import Retrofit here. The thing is, I will import Retrofit all together. So let's go all the way up here and look at Retrofit. So I want to use not just Retrofit version 2 or whatever. I'm just going to use all Retrofit. All right. And then I will create a Retrofit builder. So a lot of the stuff that I'm going to do in this and the next few videos is going to be from the Retrofit documentation. So if something doesn't make sense to you, then check out the documentation. I will, of course, try to explain everything that I will build, but at the same time, you can see that you can always check out the documentation. There you will find more details on everything, and the code will be more in depth. The explanations will be potentially also more in depth. Okay, I'm just going to use this third-party library for the API calls. So what we need to use is retrofit builder dot base URL, and here we can pass in the base URL, which is the link. And now, of course, at this point, it would make sense to have a constant so that we don't need to pass in a string here, which will just be a magic string. So let's go over to our constants and actually prepare this variable here. So let's prepare several variables actually. So first of all, we will need a constant, which will be our app ID, which will be of type string. So this will be our API. And in order to get that, you need to go to your Open Weather API. You need to go to your backend. So sign in, API keys, and then select an API key here. Okay, so you can give it a significant name. I'm just using random names here. So you can copy this key and then add that into your constants here. So use your own key. You don't use mine, because it won't work as well as your own key, because it's limited to 60 calls per minute. So if many users would use my key, then it would simply not work at one point. So use your own key. There you make sure that it will not be called as often, right? And you will be able to test it correctly. Then what we will need later on is also the base URL. So as I said, in here, we need to pass in the base URL. So let's add a constant here as well. So if we use it at multiple spots in our application, we then make a change to it. We only need to make the change in this constants URL file here. Okay, so this base URL constant in our constants KT file. Okay, so the base URL will also be of type string, and it will be the link to the Open Weather Map API. So the base URL will be api.openweathermap.org/data/. And then there are multiple different units. Okay, so for example, I want to use the metric unit. So I'm going to create this value here as well. Metric unit, which will also be of type string and will be metric. So for example, we have Celsius or we have Fahrenheit and so forth. So this is what this val will take care of. Okay, at this point we can go back to our main activity and actually pass in a base URL here. So I'm going to pass in the constants dot base URL, which is going to be, of course, this URL here. So what I'm saying is I want to connect to this URL, and then what we're going to add is a converter. So I'm going to add a converter factory. So now the cool thing is I can pass in the JSON converter factory. This is pretty powerful because this is just saying that it will transfer the data into the right format. will be our JSON format. So here we need to call create, and finally we can build it. Okay, so how we do it, we say, okay, let's create a retrofit object, which we call retrofit. We build it based on the base URL. Then we will use the JSON format, so the converter factory here, and then we build it. So by default, if we don't add a header here, it will use UTF-8 and it will encode JSON accordingly. And at this point here, it will create a retrofit instance. So basically what we're doing is what is explained here. So we create a retrofit builder, we use the base URL, and then we build it. The only thing that we also added was our JSON converter factory, as you can find further down. So there are different types of converters here. You can see JSON, Jackson, Moshi, and so forth, and I'm using the JSON converter factory. So here you can add the converter factory as well. Now the next thing that we need to add is the request method. So we will build an interface for this, where we get, for example, well, in our case it's not the users list, but in our case it's the weather. So you can see here data up to this point. This is the base URL. Well, up to this point it's the base URL, and then we have 2.5, which is the latest version, and then we have the weather. So this is what we need to add to the link, and then you can see after that we have our query. So this here after the question mark is actually our query. So up to that point you could say that this is the base URL, but it's not really, because this part could change, right? So the base URL up to data will always be the same. The version could change, and this keyword usually shouldn't change, but everything after the question mark here is our query. So we create our own request based on values that we have. For example, our latitude, our longitude, and our API key. So app ID is our API key. And in order to use a query in Retrofit, what you can use is this query keyword here. So you can see you can add the query, for example, sort, which could be a string. And what we're going to use is doubles, because latitude and longitude, they are doubles. So in this case, they're just ints or whole numbers, but usually latitude and longitude are a little more precise. You can see it here, 139.01 or 35.02. So we will need to use doubles there. Okay, so let's just prepare this interface that we will need in order to create the full link. So basically we want to have this whole link and adjust that accordingly into our location, so to our code pretty much that we prepare. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new interface, and therefore maybe it makes sense to create a new folder here as well, which will be our network folder. So I'm going to create a new package, which I'm going to call network, and in there I'm going to create a new file, and it will be an interface, and I'm going to call this one weather service. So in this interface, what we need is, first of all, this add get. So we want to post a get request, so we need to pass that in, and we need to import get. So let's do that here, import from Retrofit, and I'm gonna use Retrofit 1. So Retrofit HTTP get. And what do I want to get? Well, here I pass in 2.5/weather. So as you recall, this was part of the link, and then I want to get the weather where I have multiple query objects. So here the query, which is add query, and here again we need to import Retrofit. You can see here, import Retrofit HTTP query, and the first one will be the latitude. And what do I want to have as a latitude? Well, a double value. Okay, so for the latitude, I want to have a double value. Then I'm going to create another query, which will be the longitude. So here it will be lon double. And then I need the app ID. So here query, or again add query. Here it's the app ID, which will be the app ID, which in turn is a string. So here string nullable. And then there is one thing that we don't have yet, but we will also need later on. So add query, which will be units. So if I want to pass in the units as well, for example, the system. So is it the metric system that I want to use, or what is it? So here, for example, you can see you can add something called units, which will be metric. So if you want to have it in Celsius, then you would use metric. If you want to have another system, then you can use another keyword here. So that's why I add that to the link as well. And then this getWeather function should return something. It should return a call of weather response. Now we need to import call and weather response. So let's import call from Retrofit, and let's import weather response from our own folder here. So you can see now we use call from Retrofit, we use the HTTP GET and HTTP query, and of course our own model, which is the weather response. So basically when we call this function, we want to run a call which will use our weather response as the response of this whole call. So basically we want to have a weather response object as a result, which will be a JSON object, which will contain all of the different information, such as the coordinates, the weather list, the base, the main, the visibility, and so forth. So we will get all of this information, and we get that from that call. Now we can go ahead and use that service in our main activity. So where would be a good spot? Well, here. So where we created this retrofit object, because now we can go ahead and create a service, which will be our weather service. So we create a service object, which will use our weather service interface. And here I'm going to say that this will be using our retrofit connection that we prepared. And it's going to create the weather service. And here in brackets you need to add the class. So here weather service class Java. So what we do here is we map the service interface in which we declare the endpoint and the API type. In our case it's a GET API type. And we do that along with the request parameters which are required. So we want to connect to the base URL. We want to use this weather service in order to make the URL complete. We want as a response a weather response, which is this object here. And that's what we pretty much do with this code here. So these 6 lines do this whole magic. So those lines, they prepare the URL. They say that what do we get as a result? We want to use the converter factory of JSON in order to bring it into the right format. And then we start the service, or here we don't start the service, but we prepare the service in order to finally then make a call with this service. Okay, so let's create a call, which will be call of weather response, where we use our service that we prepared here. And there we call the getWeather function. So this function here. Now, of course, we need to pass in latitude, longitude, units, and app ID. So let's do that. Let's say we want to use a latitude, longitude, then constants dot metric unit, which is going to be, if we look at it, the units, and then finally the app ID. So constants dot app ID. Now, of course, latitude and longitude are still missing. So where do we get them from? Well, it's best if we get them from whenever we call this function. So when we get the location weather details, we want to have the latitude here. So latitude, which will be a double, and then longitude, which will also be a double. Now, if we do that, of course, we need to change the call here, get location weather details, which is in our mLocation callback, where we create the location callback, where we get the latitude from the last location. Okay, and the same with the longitude. So we need to pass those two over here. So I'm just gonna pass in the latitude and the longitude when I call this get location weather details, which is this function that we just created, in which we check if we have an internet connection. If we do, then we use Retrofit to establish an internet connection with this service, and then we start the list call, or we prepare this list call first, and then we can finally start this list call. Okay, so at this point we can go ahead and use this list call NQ. So you can see everything is connected to each other. So we need to first of all prepare the retrofit. Then we can make a service or create a service based on that retrofit. And then we make a list call based on that service that we prepared, in which we need to pass in all of this information as we have prepared in our get weather function here in our weather service interface. So now we can use NQ here. Now, what is this NQ? Well, NQ is part of the call interface, which comes with Retrofit. Okay, so inside of Retrofit, we have this interface called call, which has this function execute, which is going to give us a response. Then we have NQ, which requires a callback. Then we have cancel and clone. Okay, and we are going to use NQ of this list call, because list call is a call object, which is of course this interface that is delivered by Retrofit. And we need to pass a callback object here. So in order to create a new callback object, I'm just going to use a callback weather response object as the parameter that I pass. Now here, if you want to use that, you can see it's complaining because you need to implement members. So you can need to implement on failure and on response. So let's implement those two. You can see now it has those two because callback requires on response and on failure. So on response will be once the successful HTTP response is given, and on failure will be called when we have an error. So we need to implement something that should happen on response and on failure. So what we will do is on response, I will check if the response is success. So was it successful, this response? And then I can create a weather list variable, which will be the weather response, which will be in turn the response body. So response.body. So here, if response is success, so here I'm denullifying it. So you can see here, once there is a successful response, what I want to do is I want to get the body. So what that body will be is basically this whole thing here. So this whole string, so to speak, the whole JSON object, the biggest JSON object, which contains all of the sub objects, so to speak. Okay, so I want to get this whole body, which contains everything, and then I can potentially tear it apart afterwards. So I can break it into its little pieces. But for now, I want to keep it simple, and I want to just log it. So let's log it, log I, response result should be the weather list. And it's of course this weather list here. Okay, so this is if the response is positive and the response is a success. Otherwise, so if the response is not success, what I want to do is I want to create a variable here, which will be the response code. So response code, and I want to see what kind of response code I got. So is it a positive response code? Well, at this point it won't be because it's not success, right? And success is 200 to 300. a response code of 200 to 300 is positive, but then 400, for example, is negative. So I can say if it's 400, then log something to the error logging and say error 400, bad connection, something like that. If the response code is 404, then it's something like not found. Okay, so 404, for example, then we can log something like error 404, not found. And otherwise, it's just gonna be a generic error that we're gonna throw. So we're just gonna say something like error, generic error. Okay, and then of course, what shall we do when we get a failure response here? Well, I'm just gonna throw something like error, and then here the throwable message, we're just gonna say error to string. So whatever the throwable is, we're gonna take the message and make a string out of it. Okay, so this was a very long video, and we had to go through a lot of important stuff, and I repeated myself sometimes because I think it's unnecessary to understand the whole connection of it, because a lot of things that we have covered in this video are things that we have not seen before and we have not used before. So I tried to make the connection between the different things that we have learned and that we have not learned, and the documentation, and also the classes that are in the background and everything. So these are things that you learn by really digging deep into the documentation, by looking at some example projects and so forth. This is not something that you would just code down without having any experience, without having looked at this API, or without having looked at the third-party library and stuff like that. So you would really need to dig deep into the library in order to understand everything that is going on, okay? So I'm not expecting you to understand all of that directly and be able to replicate it directly, but what I would like you to understand is that this is the procedure that you have to go through each time that you want to use a third-party library. So you need to look up some examples, check it out, see how Retrofit works. But the beauty now is you know how Retrofit works, and now you will be able to use API calls, which is basically your bread and butter when you work as an Android developer. All right, so at this point we can test this application, and we check our logcat. Then we can see we get a response result here, which is a weather response object, which has coord, which is a coordinate object which contains a longitude and latitude. Then we have the weather, which is a list, but we probably just get one value. Yeah, we just get one value with an ID, main, description, and icon, base station, and so forth. So we have everything here, and that is beautiful. All right, so that works, and now we can go on and use this response in order to display the data accordingly. Okay, so I'd say let's go over to the next video. I think this one is long enough. See you there.